I'm Sean Lee. I am the Business and Human Rights Manager at Anti-Slavery International. We have been one of the key NGOs working on the EU's proposed forced labor regulation. So this is the regulation that would prohibit the import, trade, and export of goods made with forced labor on the EU market. We think that this legislation, if carefully drafted and effectively enforced, can have a tremendous impact on state-imposed forced labor, which is what we're going to speak to today. When I'm talking about state-imposed forced labor, we will get into this in a lot more depth and show you what exactly that looks like on the ground. But I'm talking about when the state, the government, with its huge power and its responsibility for setting the rules of society, forces people through coercion and threats and violence to leave their homes, leave their jobs, leave their families, and go and work in the fields, in the factories, feeding into global supply chains that we are all aware of. But we will get into that. We are today so fortunate to have these two tremendous coalitions who are experts in state-imposed forced labor, and they are working each in their own context and their own regions to end state-imposed forced labor. So we have the Cotton Campaign, who are a coalition of labor, human rights organizations, academics, trying to end forced labor and improve working conditions for cotton pickers in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, and more recently Turkmenistan, which we'll be looking at today, and the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region, which is another coalition made up of civil society, trade unions, Uyghur-led organizations, investors, faith-based organizations, working to end state-sponsored forced labor and other egregious human rights abuses of people from the Uyghur region. Both of these coalitions have very unique perspectives, have to work in individual contexts, but they are united in the belief that the EU has incredible power and can greatly influence activities to address state-imposed forced labor. They are united in the belief that this law, if carefully drafted and effectively enforced, can have a good impact on the millions of people who are in state-imposed forced labor today. And now I will be quiet and hand over to the experts here. So first I'd like to invite up Charlotte.
Hi everyone, I'm Charlotte Tate. I'm the advocacy lead with the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region. So first, we will have a panel discussion about what is state-imposed forced labor and what it looks like in both the cases of the Uyghur region and Turkmenistan. And in developing policy solutions to address state-imposed forced labor in supply chains, it's essential to understand how repressive the situation is on the ground. So to start off, I'd love to hear from Arslan Hidayat, the program director from Campaign for Uyghurs, about what the conditions are like for people living in the Uyghur region.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Arslan Hidayat. Thank you, Charlotte. Just quickly, I don't want to get too much into the atrocities. I'm sure you've heard of them. I'm sure you've heard of the forced sterilization. I'm sure you've heard of the forced abortions, the mass internment. The internment camps have turned into full-blown prisons now. What's going on the ground, where you have people who are outside of these prisons in an open-air prison, and then you have people in prison. It's not like any other prison. So I'll just speak from my personal own story. I got married 2 years ago. And we just recently celebrated our 2nd-year anniversary, and I haven't met my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, and my 2 brothers-in-law, because they're serving anywhere between 13 and 17 years in prison because of certain apparently thought crimes, because they were apparently planning to commit terrorist attacks. And this is a blatant crime. These false charges are put on all Uyghurs. And this is why they're being put into these camps. And these and Uyghurs have no access to the outside world. China does a very good job of censoring and blocking these atrocities. Recently, you would have seen the news inviting people to come and see for yourself, come to Xinjiang yourself. Well, I would like to go to the Uyghur region, and I would like to meet my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, my two brothers-in-law, and the rest of my family, but I simply can't. And they do a very good job of hiding this. And they do this through their own state-run media, but they also do it through the CCP propagandists. They go and visit the region, and they take images of the happy dancing Uyghurs. You simply don't see the crimes being perpetrated. And right now, these crimes through a people's court have been determined to amount to genocide and crimes against humanity. And parliaments and certain governments have labeled this as genocide as well. But with regards to Uyghur forced labor, and I have to make this very clear, Uyghurs have absolutely no opportunity to be candid about any subject. Now, we're in Belgium, and if I were to step out onto the streets and ask any Belgian or anyone to talk about any of the social issues or any criticisms that they have of the government, I'm sure I'm going to get a plethora of opinions. But in China, and especially within the Uyghur region, you're not going to get any dissent, let alone anything about forced labor or that there is voluntary, that they wanted to be part of these so-called labor transfer efforts to alleviate poverty in the region. So anything, and I want to make this very, very clear, that it is absolutely impossible for companies operating in the Uyghur region to conduct any quote unquote due diligence or audits to guarantee the absence of forced labor. Audits simply don't work, and disengagement is key. So, and this is the environment that's on the ground because it is very opaque and horrifically oppressive. And I implore each of us to remember our moral responsibility. We must not take and we must not be complicit in the perpetuation of Uyghur forced labor, nor can we be complicit through the consumption of tainted goods, because our governments who still deal with China are making us and our fellow citizens complicit in Uyghur forced labor, because many people still don't know. There's still not enough awareness being raised on this issue. And as representatives in the various parts of the world, and especially we're here in the EU, we need to stand firmly to our commitment to justice and humanity, and ensuring that when we make our policies, that it is based on the facts. I mean, how can we be? I've only got a few minutes to touch on this, but how can we be sourcing goods from a government or regime that's committing genocide and crimes against humanity? These aren't my words. These have been independently verified. So throughout this session, I would like people to think about just some of these issues raised. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arslan. Next, I'll turn to Babur Ilchi, the program manager at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Babur, can you tell us a little bit about how Uyghur forced labor is entering corporate supply chains?
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. So Uyghur forced labor is pervasive in the Uyghur region and in global industries. These industries are apparel, to PVC, to mining, to the solar industry, to the seafood industry, and to the automotive industry. Supply chains have been linked in all these industries, in all these systems, and these companies have become complicit in Uyghur forced labor. These international companies that operate these supply chains are becoming complicit in this system of forced labor and a regime of repression in the Uyghur region. In 2021, the Chinese government itself had reported that there were 3.2 million labor transfers. These workers are often paid very little or not at all, and the costs of boarding them, housing them, transporting them are deducted from their payment, which in effect forces them to owe money to their employer. Let's take this example of the automobile and how complex it is to create one and how interlinked its supply chains are. So in order to make a car, you need aluminum, steel, you need copper, you need lead, And especially for electric vehicles, which are becoming a fast growing industry, you need lithium, you need cobalt, you need nickel, graphite, and manganese. So not all these materials are being mined or extracted in the Uyghur region, but the processing and refining of these materials are happening in the Uyghur region with Uyghur laborers. This is all done without regard to worker rights or environmental rights. And these refineries often produce toxic byproducts that are just dumped into the environment. And it's powered by cheap, free coal, which again uses a system of repression to enable the extraction and use of it. You cannot simply target the automobile, a car, a Ford Taurus, or a Toyota Camry. It's not possible because these supply chains are used for every vehicle, for every industry. And so you need to make sure that when you're sourcing these materials or creating these products, that you don't just, you're not using products from the Uyghur region here. This means that attempts to perform audits and human rights due diligence are ineffective. Workers can't freely speak to the voluntariness of their labor, and the coercive and repressive environment means that workers are not safe, and they're under threat and constant scrutiny if they do speak. Investigators can't privately or freely perform their investigations, and this year, actually, Mintz Consultancy, their executives were arrested for performing one of these audits, and 3 years ago already, major auditing firms have already left the Uyghur region. So auditing firms, consulting firms, they already do not do these kinds of investigations because they don't have access to the region. They don't have access to these supply chains and these companies, and they can't freely perform these kind of investigations. And for example, Volkswagen claims its Urumqi plant is free of forced labor. They say that they see no evidence, but they can't verify those kinds of claims. State-imposed forced labor is an economic incentive that has systemized the displacement and destruction of Uyghurs' way of life, placing the greater cost of life, safety, health, the environment, and culture of the Uyghur people and the region at risk. Worker safety is compromised, and the toxic refineries and the lack of care on how these supply chains get products to and from the Uyghur region to markets abroad ends up poisoning people and the environment and destroying the cultural heritage of the Uyghur people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Babur. So next we'll turn to Turkmenistan, and we'll hear from Ruslan Myatiev, the founder of Turkmen News, and Farid Tukhbatullin from Turkmen Human Rights Initiative. So first to you, Ruslan, could you please describe what the conditions are like in Turkmenistan for the people living there?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks everybody for coming. I'll show you a few slides to illustrate how the system of forced labor, state-imposed forced labor, works in Turkmenistan on just one example. And this example is from almost my hometown, which is Dashoguz. So the description, the following photos were made in that place where you see that red pin. But the system of state-imposed forced labor is pertinent and applicable to the entire country, all the regions where cotton is being grown. In Turkmenistan, tens of thousands of civil servants, and that includes teachers, kindergarten staff, banks, all other state organizations, are forced to pick cotton every year. At this very moment, while we're sitting in this room, these people are forced to pick cotton, including conscripts, by the way. The system looks like this. Every morning, crowds of people representing different state organizations, they gather in front, like at a place where they previously agreed upon. On this particular example, this is in front of the district hall in that small community called Aktepe in Turkmenistan. The person in the black cap is making the head count, who showed up and who did not. This is how it works, and people at the same time board vehicles to be taken to the fields. And you can see that very often it's not comfortable buses, but it's trucks that carry people it can take several hours actually from a pickup point to the final place, the field, and people travel like this. This is how they arrive at a cotton field. You can see on this particular picture that it's mostly women that are affected by the state-imposed forced labor system. This is how they pick, and they do it the entire day, the whole day. And then they submit the cotton that they have collected to a government representative and a farmer who notes down how many kilograms they picked. As I said, even soldiers, conscripts, are forced to pick cotton. And children, but the thing with children is not constant. It's not that it happens every year. Until 2017, this was a big problem. Now we don't see like a centralized, essential way of coercing children, but it depends on certain school directors or district officials. If they are behind the state plan to submit to collect cotton, then they can send even school children to pick cotton. Very often children need to pick cotton as a way to earn some pocket money or to replace their adult parents, civil servants, who are forced to pick cotton. Often they work alongside their parents because either there is no one to take care of them while the adult is picking cotton, or they want to earn additional money. In Turkmenistan, the situation is very close to what our colleagues describe in China. We don't have independent media, we don't have civil society. It is similarly absolutely not possible to independently verify this or that. In the past, we have had cases when certain brands who sourced from Turkmenistan, I could buy their products in the Netherlands where I am based, and the label would say made in Turkmenistan. They would convince us that they had audits, independent audits, but given the fact that there's absolutely no civil society, it's an authoritarian regime, there is no free press, free media, eventually that brand had to pull out of Turkmenistan. And it's not only the civil servants who are forced to pick cotton, but also the farmers who are forced to produce cotton. And to give you more details, I'll pass the microphone to my colleague, Farid Tukhbatullin.
Hello, sorry, my English very poor, and Allison helped me with translating in English. В Туркменистане сохранилась советская система управления, в том числе в производстве хлопка. Только колхозы переименовали в объединение, остальное все осталось как было. Правительство назначает план, сколько нужно собирать хлопка и сеять. Правительство решает, когда нужно сеять и когда нужно убирать, то есть они указывают даты.
In Turkmenistan, the Soviet system of management has been maintained, including in the agricultural sector and particularly in the cotton production sector. The former state farms have just now been renamed into associations. The government determines how much cotton is produced, when it is time to plant the cotton in each region, how much is planted in each region, and when it is time to pick it. Can you go back to the... Нет, вверх.
И у фермеров нет права выбирать, что им сажать и сколько сажать. Им приказывают, и они вынуждены исполнять, что им приказали сверху. В противном случае им угрожают забрать их землю, соответственно, оставить всю семью без работы и без дохода.
Farmers don't have the right to choose what they plant, and they don't have control over their own land. They, the government makes all these decisions. They're ordered to, how much cotton they have to plant, how they have to carry out the agricultural technology. The only thing that motivates them is the fear that if they don't fulfill what the government tells them to do, they will lose access to their land, their families will be unemployed, and they won't be able to feed their families.
Их положение усугубляет плохая организация работы в сельском хозяйстве. Снабжение арендаторов семенами, удобрениями, горючим и техникой очень плохое, а в последние годы очень мало воды для орошения хлопка. Соответственно, снижаются доходы фермеров.
The system is worsening the poor system of management of agriculture in general, including the provision of seeds to farmers, fertilizers, machinery, and other technology. The drought of the last couple of years has also negatively affected cotton yields and is leading to lower and lower profits and lower and lower income for rural families.
Те данные, которые мы собираем, подтверждают и продовольственный кризис, который наступил в стране, и правительство вынуждено реализовывать основные продукты по фиксированным ценам, так как покупать по рыночным ценам у населения нет возможности.
The poor management of the agricultural system is worsening the food crisis in Turkmenistan. And so now the government is forced to sell key food products, including bread, flour, and vegetable oil, at fixed prices because market prices are unsustainable or unfulfillable for most families.
Можно назвать еще следующие причины плохого состояния сельского хозяйства в целом. Это недостаток квалифицированных кадров, коррупция повсеместная и экологическая ситуация, которая ухудшается все время.
Among the reasons for the poor situation of the agricultural sector in general, we can see that it is the poor qualification of personnel, systemic corruption, and the worsening ecological system.
Все это результаты политики правительства. У людей нет выбора, кроме как работать в условиях полного диктата властей, где единственным стимулом для них является страх остаться без земли.
The system is all thanks to state policy. People have no choice except to work in the conditions of complete dictatorship of the state, where the only motivation for their work is the fear that they will be left without their land and without a means to feed their families.
Туркменских фермеров, если нельзя назвать реально рабами, то они очень близки к этому.
For Turkmen farmers, if we can't call them actual slaves, then it's something quite close to that.
Спасибо.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to our translator. It's clear from these presentations that state-imposed forced labor is organized by the state and enforced by the state, whether it is carried out for the benefit of the state, like in Turkmenistan, or carried out for the benefit of the private sector, like in the Uyghur region. Because it is controlled by the state, private sector cannot effectively mitigate this form of forced labor. So next, we will turn to our following panel. So I will pass it over to Allison Gill. Yeah, and please, if we could change out the panelists as well. Thank you so much.
Ruslan. So in the first part of our discussion, we heard about what state-imposed forced labor is, what it looks like specifically in Turkmenistan and in the Uyghur region, and how state-imposed forced labor differs fundamentally from forced labor as it appears in the private sector context. And just to reiterate the point, because I don't think we can say it too many times, forced labor state-imposed forced labor is forced labor that is organized by the government with the entire weight of the government apparatus behind it. And that means that it is impossible for private entities like companies to make effective due diligence to identify it, to mitigate it, to prevent it, or to provide remedies. So typically, we want companies to be doing exactly this work, but in the state-imposed forced labor context, the requirements on companies are actually quite different. So we will now turn to the issue of how state-imposed forced labor affects the EU, how we see forced labor products or products produced with forced labor coming into the EU market, and what specific unique policy solutions are required at the EU level to effectively address it. First, I'd like to turn to Patricia Carrier, who is the business engagement lead for the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor. Patricia. Are companies taking the necessary steps to address the Uyghur forced labor risks in their supply chains? And you heard from Babur just how many supply chains are affected, and he only ticked off a few. And if they're not taking the necessary steps, what else is necessary?
Thank you, Allison. I hope you can all hear me. It's a pleasure to be here today to represent the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region. In response to Allison's question, the short answer is no, companies have not been taking the necessary steps to ensure that there is no Uyghur forced labor in their supply chains. The response by companies has been very disappointing. We now have years of research and evidence showing just how much tainted cotton is in apparel supply chains, how much polysilicon that is produced in the Uyghur region with forced labor is going into solar panels. As was noted, like electric vehicles, the demand for solar panels is only going to increase in the coming years. And yet we have a very large proportion of the global supply coming from the region. And yet these companies that have had this information for many years are still refusing to do what is expected of them, which is to completely disengage from the region at every level of their supply chain, which includes not only direct sourcing, but also indirect sourcing or via sub-suppliers. So that is the demand of the coalition. That is the only way companies can ensure that they are not exposed to Uyghur forced labor. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, companies will continue to provide justifications or reasons for why they can't take the necessary steps that are expected of them. And that includes giving reasons why they can't map or trace their supply chain down to raw material level, or the fact that these components and materials that they need for their goods are so concentrated in the Uyghur region that they can't find alternative sourcing. And I'll note in a moment that these are false, and this is shown through recent developments in supplies of key products and components that I've just mentioned. Again, as my colleague Babur has already mentioned, there is more and more research, including just 2 weeks ago, of the use of Uyghur forced labor in so many different sectors. Most recently, we saw an investigation into seafood processing, but also in the mining, extraction, and refining sectors. So many of the raw materials, commodities, and components that go into so many of our products, not just apparel, but jewelry, electronics, EV vehicles, solar panels, and also a lot of other renewable products that we'll be relying on in the coming years, all contain components that have been refined or processed or produced in the Uyghur region. And the government is spending a lot of money and effort to ensure those sectors are concentrated in the region. So this isn't accidental. This is very much part of the state policy to make industry reliant on the region, which, just as a side note, is creating a false low-cost supply chain for companies. So as I noted, there have been a few exceptions of companies showing leadership and deciding to exit the region. We've seen a number of apparel brands publicly commit to and take steps to exiting the region. And they've done this not only because it is a moral imperative, but also because they simply could not operate in the region under their own codes of conduct without being able to conduct human rights due diligence, as we've already heard. But also it's simply impossible to operate pursuant to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and the OECD guidelines in the region. It's simply not a practical possibility to do so. While we know that companies, some, are taking steps to exit the region, they do not speak very publicly about it, which is a shame. And we need much more leadership shown by those companies who are taking those steps and making that effort. So ultimately, voluntary measures are not enough. A handful of global apparel brands is not enough to show the Chinese government that this system of state-imposed forced labor will not be withstood within global supply chains. What is needed is hard law with real legal risk and accountability and liability behind it. We've seen this with so many other voluntary measures that have fallen short when it comes to global supply chains, and this is the same. So really, it is when you have legal risk and fear of legal liability that really drives change within leadership of companies who will then steer procurement and supply chains and give the demand basically to shift and find alternative sourcing. So this is what we've seen with, for example, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US. Ever since the enforcement and enactment of that piece of legislation, we have seen changes in certain supply chains. The percentage of cotton in the region is decreasing. The percentage of polysilicon production in the region is decreasing a bit. So we see that companies are shifting out of the region because they want to sell their products in the US market. So the argument that we still hear sometimes that our industry is highly reliant on the region, we can't find alternative sourcing, it will take too long to find alternative supply chains, is simply false. And I think the changes in those, for example, just two products and inputs into apparel and solar panels demonstrates this quite clearly. And I also want to note that there is a risk that those goods, those tainted goods that are no longer able to enter the US market will be dumped into the EU market. And so unless there is a, as Sean has already said, a carefully drafted and robustly enforced mechanism here, those goods will start to flood the EU market and others as well. So I'll just close by saying companies, when we engage with them directly, many of them are also wanting a similar type of mechanism here. It enables them to use their leverage with their suppliers and sub-suppliers. Again, with that legal risk and compliance at play, it really allows companies to drive that change down their supply chains and shift their sourcing in a way that would not be possible or as perhaps easy in the absence of such a legal mechanism in place. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Patricia. Since we're doing okay on time, I hope it's okay if I ask you a brief follow-up question. You described the need to have real legal risk for companies so that they will extricate their supply chains from risks to exposure to Uyghur forced labor. Could you just briefly explain what is the risk that you're referring to? We know that there are lots of kinds of legal risk. So are we talking about the risk of prosecution? Are we talking about the risk of consumer action? What is the risk that you're referring to? And for those in this audience who may not be familiar with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, could you just briefly describe what that mechanism is?
Sure. So the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act bans the importation of any good made in whole or in parts with Uyghur forced labor. So coming directly from the Uyghur region or using Uyghur forced labor through other programs such as forced labor programs. A company that is trying to, or an importer that is trying to bring goods into the US market must show basically that Uyghur forced labor has not been used in the production of that good in order to be imported and sold into the US market. And Allison, I hope that. And so when I talk about legal risk in terms of this type of mechanism, I'm talking about a good not being sold on the market. And therefore losing access to what I believe is the biggest market or one of the biggest markets in the world. That poses not only a financial risk to a company, but also, and a legal risk as well, but reputation risk. There is a lot of advocacy happening around companies that blatantly have not done anything about Uyghur forced labor in their supply chains when they've been exposed. And I'll just note as well, investors are increasingly looking at this issue and trying to identify problematic companies that they really don't want on their portfolios or in their indices, for example, because of this reason.
Thanks, Patricia. Let's now turn to GLJ-ILRF, who is the Forced Labor Project Coordinator from the Worker Rights Consortium, a Washington, D.C. based worker rights advocacy organization. Jauher, as you know, and as being part of a labor organization, in labor, we typically do not call for companies to disengage from problematic suppliers. We typically want companies to stay, if there are labor problems, to stay and engage, help remediate those problems, and generally improve conditions for workers at those factories. Sometimes we call this cutting and running, is when you drop a supplier without staying to remediate. However, I want you to talk a little bit about why the situation is different in the case of Uyghur forced labor and state-imposed forced labor generally. What is the responsible action companies should take?
Thank you, Allison. As you mentioned, in the Uyghur region, it is for the case of Uyghur forced labor situation, it is state-sponsored, state-imposed Uyghur forced labor, which is widespread and systemic. And also egregious human rights abuses have been committed by state actors in the region, and the entire region has been placed in a vice grip of repression and surveillance and terror. Also, it makes the prevailing environment of repression and fear that make human rights due diligence impossible. Also, for credible due diligence on the ground, for using its leverage or to prevent, mitigate, and remedy abuse within the supply chain is also practically impossible at the moment because companies simply don't have any level of leverage, and the Chinese government has full control in the Uyghur region, whether we're talking about the factories or the people or the region itself, and for companies, they also don't have access to workers privately. And also, when I say workers, it's a terminology that we use here, but back in my homeland, the Uyghur region, those workers are considered as detainees because those workers don't have the rights to say no. And even though it's advertised as voluntary positions, people don't have the right or the choice or the options to refuse those positions to be placed in their lives. And oftentimes those workers already had jobs before being put in those positions. And therefore, audits, accreditation schemes, or any supplier attestations should not be seen as sufficient evidence to prove a supplier or a sub-supplier are not using Uyghur forced labor. And as Babur mentioned earlier, many auditors have already stopped operating in the Uyghur region. And we have also, they have pointed out to the extreme surveillance, not towards the Uyghur people, but also to the auditors. So if auditors themselves cannot guarantee their own safety, their own freedom of expression in the Uyghur region, how can they say when they issue their certificate, that means the workers are indeed telling the truth, because workers cannot speak with them privately, the auditors cannot speak with them privately, and there have been instances of auditors arriving in the Uyghur region, getting arrested at the airport without even setting a foot in the Uyghur region. So, and there have I also earlier Patricia mentioned about the seafood industry where there were links to Uyghur forced labor. And I'd like to note that just a couple weeks ago, the same report that Patricia mentioned, the factories that were mentioned in the report, they had gone through audits, and they had been certified for their very practices. But later, we found out that Uyghur forced labor was found in those factories, and these companies that were mentioned in the fishing reports are not the only ones that have been linked to Uyghur forced labor while being certified by auditors. So and Allison mentioned, so why usually labor rights organizations wouldn't suggest, leaving, disengaging, but in this case we would. As I mentioned, those workers, they had their jobs previously, and the intention for labor rights organizations to in the past case to prevent a company just to cut and run is because they want to, or we want to preserve those jobs for those workers. We want them to continue to have jobs. But in the Uyghur forced labor cases, workers don't oftentimes don't get paid, or get paid way below minimum wage, and oftentimes they even have to their transportation fees, the dorm fees, their meals have to even be deducted from the very minimal salaries that they're receiving. And oftentimes, if a worker is released from the factory, they end up owing the factories, even though they could be working for 10 hours or 16 hours a day in those factories. So in conclusion, disengagement is the only way, and this is the only solution. And enforcement of a import ban or a production ban would be a key goal, or it actually drives compliance. And what is happening in the US with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act proves that it actually works, because we have seen the data. First of all, since the implementation of this law, we have seen over $1.9 million value of shipment values of products have been detained since a little bit over a year and 4 months of implementation of this law. And we have also learned that compared to September 2022's Xinjiang cotton jeans sales production compared to the same time year before had dropped 40%. And we also learned that with the solar industry, which is also heavily linked to tied to Uyghur forced labor, since the implementation of this law, over 10% of the global solar that's produced in the Uyghur region had dropped. So we know that, such import bans with a regional focus, if it's enforced effectively, it could have a pretty positive impact.
Thanks, Jawahar. So what you're saying is that, in fact, effective enforcement has not only protected U.S. consumers in this case from being complicit in tainted supply chains, in supply chains where the products are produced with Uyghur forced labor, but also succeeded in changing company behavior. Yes. So we're seeing companies that used to source cotton, polysilicon for solar panels, increasingly be redirecting their sourcing to non-tainted, non-forced labor sources.
It triggered a positive reaction, and now more and more companies, without having to prove to the CBP, Custom Border Protection in the U.S., they will want to actively, reevaluate their supply chain. They want to use technologies that's available to verify whether their products are sourced from the Uyghur region. Mm-hmm. It really changed the pattern.
Thanks. Let's turn now to Raluca Dumitriescu, my colleague at Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum. Raluca is the senior coordinator of the Cotton Campaign, which seeks to eliminate state-imposed forced labor and improve labor conditions for cotton workers in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Raluca, we've heard now from Jawahar that companies actually can't take effective action to mitigate state-imposed forced labor in their own supply chains. We've heard from Patricia that voluntary corporate social responsibility action or other voluntary standards are not sufficient to drive company behavior. And so given this, why is state-imposed forced labor a problem for the EU? What should the EU do to take action to effectively prevent forced labor goods from being part of the EU market?
Thanks, Allison, for the introductions and for the very good question. I'd ask Sian if you have 2 seconds. Thanks. I prepared the slide. It will be fast. Before that comes there, let me just start by speaking a few minutes about cotton supply chains in general, how they are structured, so that we all understand why it's important that the EU introduces a strong forced labor regulation to ban the import and also the sale of products into the EU that have been made with inputs from Turkmenistan and the Uyghur region. And before I get to explaining what you are all looking at, let me just say that before cotton actually becomes a garment or a home textile, before it's turned into bed linens, towels, clothes that we are all buying in shops, it actually goes through different production stages. So once it's picked and it's cleaned from the field level, it's spun into yarn, and that's the thread. Then that thread is actually woven into fabric, and finally that fabric is cut and sewn, and is made into the finished products that we find in shops. And this map here on my left, it shows the key findings of our supply chain research, showing that Turkmen cotton enters the EU countries at all stages of production. So as raw fiber, as yarn, as fabric, and as finished goods, such as towels, bed linens, and garments. So for those of you who are not familiar with supply chains, let me just summarize the two key findings that this map is conveying. First, we know that garments and home textiles made with cotton from Turkmenistan are being sold in the EU. This is a certainty. So here on the map, I don't know if it's big enough, but you can see, or you should be able to see, that countries like the Netherlands and France are importing cotton finished goods from Turkmenistan. But this is actually not the full story, because supply chains are complex. So you probably see here, if you move it just slightly to the top, if you move the map, please, just slightly to the top, you'll see that the top importer of cotton goods from Turkmenistan is actually Turkey. And if you think that this is only Turkey's business, because Turkey is not part of the EU, and this has nothing to do with the EU, you are wrong. Because actually Turkey is the third exporter of textiles to the EU. And this means that actually all brands selling their products into the EU that buy their products from factories in Turkey actually have a risk of using Turkmen cotton in their products. So even if a particular country is not listed on this map here as importing directly finished goods from Turkmenistan, it does not mean that Turkmen cotton products are not for sale in that particular country. That was the first thing this map shows. The second, just as important, is that European manufacturers, so factories based in Europe, actually use Turkmen semi-finished goods in the production of textiles. So we have here, again, you should be able to see, Italy, Poland, and Portugal are manufacturing hubs using Turkmen cotton and cotton products. This means that factories in these countries use cotton, they use yarn, and they use fabric coming from Turkmenistan in the production of their goods. And these goods are then sold on the EU market or are exported further in other countries. So to conclude, I'd like to highlight three key things that I'm hoping everybody can remember at the end of this panel. First, and I think this map rightly testifies to that, supply chains are complex. Not sourcing directly from Turkmenistan or not sourcing directly from the Uyghur region does not mean that a company has no Turkmen or Uyghur cotton in their products. Second, EU action to ban the import and sale of products made with forced labor in Turkmenistan and in the Uyghur region is critical. The EU is the largest trading bloc in the world, and it's really time that it takes action. As research shows here, you have the map. Products made with forced labor in Turkmenistan are for sale in shops in the EU. And we've often heard from EU institutions that it's a key goal of policy that consumers in the EU don't buy forced labor products and they're not complicit or benefiting from forced labor systems. And this is really why the EU should introduce a strong forced labor legislation that will translate into action by every member state and in every member state. And also, I think it's worth mentioning, and Patricia also raised this point, that actually companies have their own policies against forced labor. But as you can see, and as this research shows, this is really not enough because Turkmen cotton and cotton products continue entering the EU. So again, that's why it's really important that we have regulation at the EU level and that this regulation bans the import and sale of products made with state-imposed forced labor in Turkmenistan and the Uyghur region. And finally, and this is the third point I'd like to make, again, I'm piggybacking on what Patricia has said here, my fellow panelists from the Uyghur Coalition. Doing this at EU level will really create a level playing field, which is much needed. So for example, we mentioned the UFLPA, we also have in the US an import ban against products made with cotton originating in Turkmenistan. And again, from supply chain research, we actually know that these products that are denied entry in the US are often rerouted to other markets. So I'll close by saying again that we need this strong forced labor regulation to make sure that the EU is not a dumping ground for forced labor products, and also to make sure that companies retailing here are not profiting from forced labor in either Turkmenistan or the Uyghur region. Thanks. And happy to answer any questions as well.
Thanks, Raluca. So cotton is an interesting case study. Cotton is the key product that is produced with state-imposed forced labor in Turkmenistan. It is one of the many products produced with state-imposed forced labor in the Uyghur region, where it actually comprises 20% of the world's cotton supply. So it is vitally important that forced labor cotton, as well as other goods made with state-imposed forced labor, not be part of commerce. But Ruslan, I'm wondering then if you could speak to why, since the EU has now a piece of legislation on the table regulating forced labor goods, why is a regional ban mechanism as part of that legislation would be an essential component to preventing products made with state-imposed forced labor from commerce in the EU?
Well, because in settings like Turkmenistan, it is safe to say that all cotton produced in that country is made with forced labor. In our presentations, we showed that the government of Turkmenistan is first of all, is the main employer in the country. So a teacher or a doctor or a bank employee simply cannot say no when their managers send them to the cotton fields, because they'll lose their jobs. They won't be able to feed their families. Yeah, that's why they comply and they go. And secondly, it's the state that entirely controls cotton production. So, I mean, it's really, really obvious that the focus should be made on regional. You know, the regional context should be reflected in the laws that are being discussed.
I think maybe a question for all of the panelists. One thing that we haven't talked about explicitly, but has been clear from all of your presentations, is that many of the goods we're talking about are inputs or primary components or semi-finished goods. So there are cases, and we know from research done by our colleague organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project, that there are sometimes where boxes are literally shipped into U.S. commerce labeled, red dates from Xinjiang. So those should be easy enough to identify and to prevent from entering into commerce, although not always. But cotton, cobalt, lithium, these are inputs that are sometimes found in finished goods that are often blended with legitimate sources of those goods. Could you speak a little bit about the challenges that presents, and then why this mechanism that we're talking about is so important? We hear from companies a lot that they can't possibly trace their supply chains, but then Raluca, with publicly available data, is able, in fact, to show the flow of cotton from Turkmenistan into the EU. So would you address that a little bit? Patricia, Jauher, any of you?
I'll briefly answer, and I'll let my colleagues follow up. I think that's the one sort of due diligence activity we would expect of companies to do, that complete tracing and mapping down to supply chain, or I'm sorry, raw material level. to ensure that those inputs into the finished product are not tainted with Uyghur forced labor or with cotton from Turkmenistan. And there are a lot of, in addition to desk-based research that companies can undertake to do that mapping of their supply chains, there is a lot of resources now available by academics such as Sheffield Hallam University who have done a lot of these reports that have mapped supply chains in the EV sector, solar sector, and apparel. These academic reports that have mapped these supply chains and named global companies that are linked to the Uyghur region, they have also shared their methodology, their techniques, their tools, so that companies can do that desk-based research themselves. There really is no justifiable reason why a company cannot commit resource to doing that same type of mapping and tracing that a university is already doing. A. B, there's also been an influx of tech tools available for companies to test their own products. Confidentially, we have spoken to apparel brands that have committed a lot of resource to try to exit the Uyghur region. They've put in place all types of platforms and chain of custody tools and mechanisms, but they do isotopic testing, for example, to do spot checks on their own product to ensure there is no Uyghur region cotton. And they are still finding it sometimes, even though they have put in a lot of, as I said, capacity and resource to try and ensure that doesn't happen, to prevent and mitigate that. So just to say, there are a lot of publicly available resources in order to do that first step of trying to identify your exposure to the region. And then on top of that, there are, as I said, different tech tools, not just isotopic testing, but other supply chain tools and services that can be employed by companies as well. Oh, okay. I talked about isotopic testing, sorry. I don't know if anyone else has comments.
I'm going to turn it over. Let me just map out how we're going to spend the rest of our time. I'm going to ask the panel one more question. I think then we'll open it up to questions both from the audience in the room and also to people who are joining us online. And then we'll hear from Anti-Slavery International to talk about the forced labor regulation that is being proposed in the EU, and we'll have some closing remarks. So get your questions ready. And while you do that, I'm going to ask the panel one more question. So Ruslan talked about a regional mechanism and why a regional mechanism is key to effective enforcement. And Patricia, you alluded to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US. We've talked a little bit about supply chain tracing and why companies have the obligation, in fact, to know their own supply chains. In terms of enforcement, when you have a situation of state-imposed forced labor, as in Turkmenistan, the Uyghur region, what should the presumption be on companies using inputs from those regions so that the companies are actually bearing some of the burden of their own supply chain, so that all of the burden doesn't become placed on the shoulders of enforcement authorities to identify these goods?
So with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and what we are demanding of companies, as I mentioned earlier, is a complete exit from the region at every level of the supply chain. So some companies, many companies, although as I've already said a number of times, only a small number will speak to this publicly, they understand that any input or good being produced in whole or in part in the region is using Uyghur forced labor. So there is no workplace in the region where you can try to find somebody who's working voluntarily, for example. There is a presumption that goods made or inputs being produced in the region are being made with Uyghur forced labor. And so therefore, that is why we are saying as a company, you have no leverage to mitigate or remediate that situation. There is, when it's state policy, there is simply no way for a company to try to influence or incentivize suppliers to change working conditions as you would in a private sector setting. And so therefore, that is why we have such a strong position on this, a complete exit. Otherwise, again, you're stuck in this circle of not being able to undertake due diligence, but then having perhaps, unscrupulous auditors saying they can prove that, oh, your facility is clean. It's simply not true. It's a fallacy. And so therefore, that is why we say there should be a rebuttable presumption that goods made in either Turkmenistan or the Uyghur region have been made with Uyghur or with forced labor in those contexts, and then switch the burden to the company to prove, no, they're not actually. And we can show you through mapping and tracing our supply chain how this is not the case. I don't think you can when you have exposure and links to these two contexts. But it does then flip the burden from a state having to show, or a government having to show, that these goods have been made with forced labor to, well, we know they likely are. It's your obligation as an importer to try and prove otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, why don't you add?
Thanks. So very quickly, of course, again, piggybacking on what Patricia said, not only that the situation is very similar in Turkmenistan in that companies cannot take any meaningful steps to prevent or remediate forced labor and that they need to disengage at all stages of production. I think it's also important to mention, and that's what the supply chain research is showing, the map I showed you before, that for such a legislation to be implemented effectively, it's important that both companies and governments understand really which are the third countries that trade into cotton and cotton products coming from Turkmenistan and the Uyghur region. So for example, like I said, in the case of Turkmenistan, we have cotton traveling primarily through Turkey and Pakistan, also other places, but it would be important for shipments and importers from these third countries to be targeted and reviewed.
Thanks, Gianluca. So let's open it up for questions. I welcome questions from the audience in the room, from our audience online. And the questions, please feel free to direct them to our panelists now, or also the panelists from the first discussion, Arslan, Babur, and Farid. I see. Why don't we take a couple? So I see two in the back.
Yeah. Is there any evidence that Uyghur workers, detainees, are being transported outside of the Uyghur region to do forced labor outside of that region? So therefore, you could be sourcing products, raw materials from another area, but still be guilty by default of using forced labor.
Jahar, before you answer, why don't we take a couple of questions and we'll consolidate. Did you have a question as well?
I have two questions, one easy, another one a little bit more complex. The easy question is, where can I go and see an inventory of companies who are doing business in these two locales that you've pointed to? My question concerning Turkmenistan is whether it merits kind of differentiating between China and Turkmenistan to the extent that China cares for its reputation on a global basis. They're trying to proselytize countries to follow the Chinese model or whatever. Turkmenistan strikes me as an isolated entity. And I do wonder whether if our economic penetration in Turkmenistan is the only liberalizing force in the country, whether you need to treat that somewhat differently than how we're treating the China investment. And so I'm just curious. I know that there was some hope a couple of years ago when the son of the former dictator took over, that he might start a new liberalizing. That hasn't panned out. So other than the economic penetration in Turkmenistan, what is there that you could pin your hopes on for any possible liberalization, democratization of the country?
Thanks. Why don't we start with first the question, Jawhar, I think you wanted to answer this. Is it true that there's not only forced labor pervasive in the Uyghur region, but also through a system of labor transfers, so that a company could potentially be doing business with a supplier in mainland China outside of the Uyghur region and still be exposed to a risk of Uyghur forced labor?
The short answer is yes. let's first use the Chinese data. Otherwise, the Chinese government is going to claim us US propaganda or Western propaganda again. So according to Chinese government's own report from 2021, as of 2021, about 3.2 million Uyghur labor transfers were implemented throughout the entire China, not just within the Uyghur region, but outside of China as well, to over a dozen cities from Shandong, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Beijing. And I personally have talked to several of them as well. And the conditions in those factories and those labor transfer programs varies. Some, it could seem like it's just like a regular factory and they could possibly not be mistreated physically, but it doesn't mean that it is not forced labor, because they were forced to be placed into such programs without an option for saying no. They could be still getting paid, but that doesn't mean it's not forced labor. And there are factories where workers were abused and treated and not being paid. So conditions varies. And let's talk about the Western reports. Was it last year? From the there was a report that released from the Sheffield Hallam University called Laundering Cotton, which mapped out linked over 107 companies linked to various international brands, with to proving that how it's possibly linked to Uyghur forced labor programs and how there are Uyghur labor transfer programs as well. So yes, there are evidence out there, and I highly recommend you check out Sheffield Hallam University's page. There are several reports out there, not just on cotton, but on several other industries. There's also on the mining industry. There's a seafood industry that we just mentioned was on labor transfer programs, where Uyghurs were shipped out of the Uyghur region and shipped to Shandong to work in such programs without a choice.
Did anyone else want to speak to this this question? Patricia, maybe do you want to talk about how that's addressed in the U.S., if that's of interest here, just very briefly?
So I want to highlight the seafood investigation that Jar just mentioned, because as she said, it very much focuses on the forced labor transfers, and it's quite recent evidence that it's the most recent, I think, evidence we have. So it's quite comprehensive, and I think it breaks down what that looks like as well. Because one thing we do hear from companies and media as well is conditions in the region or in facilities even don't look that bad anymore. You know, what's happened to the satellite photos with these prisons and camps and things with barbed wire. And I think Babur made the point, and as well as Arslan, that the repressive and coercive environment in the region means no one really can say no when asked to participate in these types of programs. In terms of, I think you said inventories, Sheffield Hallam University also has published 2 lists on its website, one with entities operating within the Uyghur region, and one list of entities that have been named in research or media as having taken part in forced labor transfer programs. And so I think that's also a great resource in terms of mapping and tracing and trying to see whether you are in any way linked to any of these entities. Did you ask me to speak to something else?
If you just want to very briefly address how transfers outside the region, forced labor transfers outside the region, are addressed under current U.S. legislation.
So would that be the entity list?
Mm-hmm.
So under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, there is an entity list as well that names companies that participate in these forced labor transfer programs as well, and any good made in whole or in part by these entities are also banned from entering the U.S. market under the same provisions of the UFLPA as we have been discussing. So the rebuttable presumption again would be applied.
Thanks. I had asked Patricia to speak to that because it goes beyond the scope of what a regional ban would capture, obviously, but is still being captured in the U.S., and I think there is a provision for that in proposed EU regulation as well. Ruslan, do you want to now speak to the interesting question posed about whether or not it makes sense to differentiate in a way between the forced labor systems of Turkmenistan and China?
Yes, indeed, a good question, especially about the reputation. Well, I should say that Turkmenistan also cares about its reputation, despite being perhaps more closed to international scrutiny. I can give you an example. For example, the government is now heavily engaged with the ILO. ILO had several field trips to Turkmenistan. And in fact, earlier in October, earlier in October, they had a field mission to Turkmenistan. And for the first time in, I don't know, so many decades, in the months of September, neither teachers nor doctors were sent to pick cotton. We, with our partners from the Turkmen Initiative for Human Rights, we immediately published it because, well, that's what we do. We are media organizations as well. However, later in October, we received information that even teachers and doctors were again sent to pick cotton. So the mission has left, or I don't know, has left that particular region. At the same time, the representatives of the U.S. Department of Labor was it right? DRL visited Turkmenistan. So to us, it looks like, you know, a hide and seek game, or cat and mouse game, whatever you want to call it. So the inspection, international inspection, while they were in Turkmenistan, civil servants were not sent to pick cotton. Once they left the country, everything returned to where it was in the past. What else works? Well, we see that political pressure works. When in 2018, the US adopted this withhold release order that said anything containing Turkmen cotton in full or in part will be banned from the US ports. Even though Turkmenistan did not have huge trade levels with the US, it was a great and strong political signal to the government of Turkmenistan. Guys, you have forced labor and you need to fix it. Similar signals, similar messages should be sent from the EU. Don't approve and adopt the partnership and cooperation agreement with Turkmenistan that is still pending at the European Parliament. When it comes to human rights dialogue between the EU and Turkmenistan, raise the issue of forced labor, just like the issue of political prisoners, just like the issue of lack of media freedom, because really this is the country where you cannot conduct any type of independent monitoring, be that on forced labor, be that on prison conditions, be that on the rights of women, be that on LGBT rights. LGBT is in fact outlawed. You can get a prison term if you are practicing same-sex, relationships. So this works. There should be these messages, these political signals should be sent every time there is any sort of engagement with the government, and they do care about their reputation.
Thanks, Ruslan. I have a couple of questions from our online audience. Raluca, I think we could start with you for this one. Are there lessons learned or best practices from efforts to address state-imposed forced labor in Uzbekistan that could be applied to the situation in Turkmenistan?
Do we have half an hour or 40 minutes? Yes, definitely there are lessons learned. I'm glad this was brought up. I'm not sure if everybody here in the room is familiar with that. 2 years ago, after almost 15 years of policy advocacy and campaigning, we managed, which was unthinkable when we started, which is the end of state-imposed forced labor in cotton in Uzbekistan. I would add, to what Ruslan has said, what worked in Uzbekistan seems to provide a slight opening in Turkmenistan, which is that pressure works. collective pressure works, collective advocacy works. The fact that we had what we called a pledge at that time, which was a public commitment signed by over 330 brands to be precise, committing not to use Uzbek cotton in their supply chains as long as it was made with state-imposed forced labor, work. The fact that the Uzbek government saw that, you know, brands, big brands like Gap, PVH, H&M actually committed to not use Uzbek cotton at all in their supply chains because of the terrible situation on the ground, worked. The Uzbek government understood, oh, we're starting to be isolated. We don't want that. We want to have access to international markets. We really need to do something about it. So in terms of political tools, that was really important. And to that, of course, I would add anything you can think of that we did in the last 15 years in terms of government accountability actions, UN level advocacy, ILO level advocacy, and all of that. I would conclude by saying it worked. We need to do it in the Turkmenistan and in the Uyghur region. At the same time, we have to be very clear that any solution or any slight change we're seeing on the ground coming from those governments is really thoroughly, independently monitored. It has to be robust, it has to be sustainable, because unfortunately in Uzbekistan, although we had that great achievement 2 years ago, at the moment we're seeing slight backsliding. And I will leave it to that with the message that the pressure has to continue. I don't know if we have time. There was a question coming from that corner earlier.
A couple more here, but we'll take.
Okay.
We'll take. I think Ruslan's going to come in quickly.
Just
and
to
then-
add to that, the difference between Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan is that was it 27?
2007, yeah.
2007, when Uzbekistan publicly admitted.
Oh,
17.
2017.
2017,
I thought you
sorry.
meant when
No.
our work started, which
No.
was 2007.
When the Uzbek government publicly admitted there is a problem and that they're going to be working on it, Turkmenistan, however, officially denies that this problem exists in Turkmenistan. As recent as when was the UPR thing in Geneva, just several months back, they again said there's no forced labor in Turkmenistan. And these two systems are, even though, you know, these are neighboring countries, the systems of forced labor are still different. In Turkmenistan, it's entirely state controlled, and the way the country is managed, that even one public announcement by the president on state television in prime time that, okay, from now on, we're not sending teachers, doctors, and any other civil servants to pick cotton, would make a difference. They don't even do that. While, you know, it could be in fixed, if not overnight, then quite in short time.
Thanks, Ruslan. Was there a follow-up question on this issue before I switch to another issue? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just sorry. Thanks. The difference with Uzbekistan, of course, it was desperate to get GSP plus, which Turkmenistan is not eligible to receive. So there was a financial incentive there for Uzbekistan to clean up its act, even though a lot of people such as yourselves did a lot of good work to prevent the forced labor. They did have an incentive there, which was money to behind them removing forced labor. So I'm not sure you can draw a parallel between Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan simply for that.
Maybe we can talk afterward. I would be really fascinated to learn where you see actual direct pressure coming from GSP Plus and if it's ever really been effectively enforced. But we can leave that maybe for a side discussion afterward. There was a lot of financial pressure on economic pressure on Uzbekistan, that is sure. And again, I would invite Babur, Ruslan, and Babur, Arslan, and Farid also to contribute to answers, and please come up if you like. I will just take my moderator's privilege to answer this question that was raised from the online audience. Are companies able to do anything to prevent forced labor from occurring in workplaces in the Uyghur region or Turkmenistan? I think the answer to that has been pretty clearly stated by our panelists, that companies do not have effective control over workplaces in either of those contexts, and I would argue in any context of state-imposed forced labor. I think any of our panelists are happy to discuss that in further detail, perhaps at the coffee after the discussion, but the answer is really clear. In cases of state-imposed forced labor, companies cannot take action to change it at the workplace level. So some other questions really on the business side and on the legislation side or the regulation side. Are there business networks active on the issue of state-imposed forced labor, particularly focused on the solar sector? And then another question from the online audience. Can we ask about the impact of WROs, which is the import ban mechanism in place in the US, and the UFLPA, which is the Uyghur region specific import ban mechanism effective in the US? Can these mechanisms in the US interact with the forced labor regulation being proposed in the EU? How can these two systems support each other to ensure that goods made with forced labor are not entering into major markets? Do you want to start with the business networks and solar question,
Sure,
Patricia?
I'll answer that briefly because I think yes, it's a short answer. No, we're not seeing enough leadership by industry associations and business associations. Unfortunately, it seems that they will operate at the lowest common denominator, which means if the corporate members don't want to address this issue very publicly, the association will not. And so as I've said, we need to see a lot more leadership coming from them on this issue of state-imposed forced labor, and in particular that their corporate members cannot be deferring back to audits. As we have clearly said throughout each panel, they do not work. They cannot be used in a state-imposed forced labor context, or any forced labor context for that matter. So we would love to see more industry associations come out a bit more, well, much more publicly on this and take a strong position on it. In terms of solar, same. We've been engaging with both UK and European solar industries. They don't even talk about Uyghur forced labor, despite the massive amount of polysilicon production in the region using Uyghur forced labor. It is now 35% of the world's polysilicon is being produced in the region. That's a very, very large amount. It means that almost every single solar panel out there is tainted in some way with Uyghur forced labor. I will say the European Solar Manufacturing Council has been very explicit on this issue. However, they recently published a position paper on forced labor in the solar industry and speak very explicitly on Uyghur forced labor in particular, because they do recognize the importance of solar companies and yes, solar companies throughout value chains being aware of the issue and therefore having needing to take necessary steps to ensure that they exit the region at every level of the supply chain.
And then would one of our panelists like to speak to the final question about the impact of the U.S. Import mechanisms together with the EU forced labor regulation, how they might interact and support each other? Come on up, Arslan.
Right now, the US is alone in this, and it just looks like US war on China because they're jealous of how well they're doing. It really is a case of everyone needs to be united on this. Right now, you guys are getting what's been, you know, from the borders of the US. If it doesn't make in, it'll come to you guys. So you guys have become a dumping ground, basically. And so the more avenues we cut from China, it'll push them to hopefully not use Uyghur forced labor. Yeah, in short, I don't want to.
So the systems together can bring greater economic pressure on the governments to end the system, but also protect consumers in these major markets from participating in or being complicit in forced labor systems.
And they need to work with each other because there are reports out there from the UFLPA that haven't been made public, but members in the EU, I believe, if they requested for these reports, that they'd be able to get that information, hopefully. And you're saying no, but we hope.
Thanks, Arslan. I think I'm now going to, if there are any more burning questions, I think we can take one more, but otherwise I'd like to turn the microphone over to my colleague from Anti-Slavery International. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all for being here. We have a very short presentation. I've decided that I would make it very, very slim as a PowerPoint. Yeah, so let's, I mean, it's, as you can see, it's basically like 3 main slides. And the first one, no, it's not the first one. First one is very basic. Still not. Not the one before, yes, thank you. Can you move on the next one? All right, I don't know. Back. Okay, in any case, I mean, that one is very, very quickly summarized. You've heard from our colleagues from the Uyghur Coalition, from the Turkmenistan region, from the Cotton Campaign, about what's happening at the level of their countries and how state-imposed forced labor is taking place. I just want to summarize it in 3 key issues. The scale of violations is not something that can be addressed through single product investigations. And that's why we have been calling for a regional ban, because the region-wide, it's industry-wide, it's sector-wide, depending on specific regions and industry. Therefore, having only one investigation per product, not even one investigation per company, but investigation product by product into the scale of this would be like so much effort, so much resources dedicated to it that it would not be efficient and appropriate in terms of the result that the impact we are trying to obtain. The second one is that it's a government coercive policy. There are no individual rights, there are no freedom of expression, no media freedom, no civil society to monitor anything, no social rights, no independent monitoring or due diligence possible. That has been reiterated by my colleagues here many times in advance. And the last point is that there is no remediation possible. As mentioned previously again during the seminar, the reason why we as labor rights organization are calling for responsible disengagement in the frame of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, for example, is because we want first to prioritize a worker-centered approach. We want first to make sure that the workers do not suffer further from having been forced into forced labor. However, in the situation of state-imposed forced labor, no remediation is possible. Since no remediation is possible, you cannot have any kind of influence on the ground on what is happening to the workers, and you will not solve the situation of workers even if you remain engaged there. That's one of the reasons why we cannot basically condone anything else than a regional ban. The next slide. The next slide is the one that is a bit complex, and that's the main reason why I've presented this, because otherwise it really doesn't really need a PowerPoint. But it's showing the difference in evidentiary standard that we have in the EU and the US. What you have here under the EU process is what is described under the Commission proposal. It's not what we have in the Parliament proposal yet. But what I want to demonstrate here is the lag, the big gap that we have in between the evidentiary standards. The process that we have at the EU level is starting at the level of evidence when the US is already imposing its first level of sanction. What we define as substantiated concern is the EU, is the necessary step to actually start the investigation. So at the end of the preliminary investigation, the competent authority have to define that there is a substantiated concern of forced labor before they can move into the main investigation. And then only when they are absolutely sure that forced labor is happening, there will be a finding. That finding is at the same level of what the US calls itself a finding. The problem with that is that since the inception of the US Tariff Act, there has been altogether 51 findings, which is, again, 51 WROs, sorry, and 8 findings. 8 findings mean that we have, out of those 8 findings, only 2 that came since 2016, and the rest of them were from the 50s, including, for example, 2 from Mexico on prison labor. So the level of influence, the level of enforcement that we are looking at right now is very, very high at the EU level, and that's one of the reasons that we need to actually act and find a solution by lowering the evidentiary standard. Why I'm insisting on this, it's because like all of my colleagues, when all of my colleagues have been describing the fact that EU is becoming a dumping ground, that's where it's happening. We are a dumping ground because the difference between these evidentiary standards mean that whatever is stopped at the border of the EU through a WRO, through a withhold release order, is basically pushed back from the US, from entering the US, and can access the EU because at the EU level it will pass the evidentiary standard, it will pass the investigation at that stage. So that's one of the things we need to change. And if we try to get like to the next slide. Yeah, again. Then what do we need, I mean, for strengthening the forced labor regulation in terms of how to fight efficiently and meaningfully state-imposed forced labor? My colleague said it, companies cannot do anything on their own. They need to disengage from the region. There is no remediation possible for state-imposed forced labor, unfortunately. What we can do, however, at the level of the regulation is that we need to have a commission-level coordination. We've advocated for it, and we're very happy to have MEP Letao Marcus here to explain us what's happened in the European Parliament. But we've asked indeed that there is a coordination measure taken at the EU level, first to receive the complaint from the complainants, so that it's simpler for all CSOs, workers outside of Europe to basically complain, but that's working mostly for private sector forced labor. But in the frame of state-imposed forced labor, what we need is also like a political strength and unity at the EU level, so that we have a one decision that is made by the EU as a body and not by individual member states to apply diplomatic pressure on both China and the Turkmenistan, and also like on other countries that might be borderline in using state-imposed forced labor. We're seeing like North Korea, but we're also seeing countries like Eritrea potentially, and Myanmar is somehow on the verge to it, so we're looking at it also. Diplomatic pressure is the only way we can have any kind of sustainable and meaningful impact and scalable impact. The rebutable presumption linked to a regional ban is also what we've been asking for, and the reason behind that is that we need to have this scale impact, have this scale, this intervention at scale that really allows to block all products coming from a specific sector and a specific region. We're looking at cotton from Turkmenistan, we're looking at cotton from the Uyghur region, we're looking at solar panel from the Uyghur region. I won't name them again. I mean, there are many reports now looking at it. We also need to look at it from not only like final products, but also like parts of those products. So if there is aluminium that is made coming from the Uyghur region in one product, those products made with that aluminium needs to be blocked. That's ethically and in international standards, that's the rule. So those joint criteria between like a specific sector and a specific region need to be addressed. And the only way to actually address it is indeed through this rebutable presumption. So putting the burden of proof on saying who is, on demonstrating that forced labor is happening, not on the competent authority, but on the company itself that is bringing that product. On this, what we need there also is that in Article 6.4a, which is one of the first decisions that actually can be made, there you have different levels of decision that can be made in the proposed legislation, that Article 6.4a is actually describing that you can push back the products outside of the EU and prevent the entrance. We would want that along with this rebutable presumption, there is also a decision made automatically on products from this specific region, this specific economic sectors to be blocked at the border so that they cannot enter the EU, so that we don't have to be bothered afterwards with, calling them back from wherever they've been put on shelves and take them out of the market. And the lower evidentiary standard, I've already spoken to it. The reason why we're calling for that, beyond preventing dumping, is also that we want to align and facilitate companies' compliance. We were invited a year ago to intervene in this EU-US trade dialogue. And there you had like companies from all different sectors that were basically claiming that they have like 5 to 6 different standards to comply with in terms of CS3D, in terms of forced labor, and that it's a nightmare for them to just even comply with one of them sometime. So they want to have this kind of alignment. We want it for the same reason that were explained also earlier, because we need to have coordination between the investigation between the different entities and countries that are going to have this kind of legislations. There are more countries now trying to look at it. If you're interested also afterwards, we can discuss it, because we have like a new coalition being created to bring together also knowledge across different countries and regions of the world to try to bring those import ban into place. Aligning the standards is also the security we are giving to each region, each country that will have this kind of legislation, that whatever they do, they won't be on their own, and that they won't be, targeted by China or any other country in terms of retaliation. So the stronger we will be, the more we will be, the stronger we will be. I don't know if you have any questions, otherwise I'm happy to invite Maria Manuel Letao Marquez to join here on the stage. And yeah, okay, I have just one quick question. Go ahead, Stuart.
Maybe just a comment. I do wonder specifically for state imposed whether the evidentiary level would be a bit lower.
We'd love that. At minimum for it, we'd love it.
Because I suspect that organizations such as yourself will file extensive dossiers, will file those with the competent authorities or the commission, which we hope will be a competent authority also. And it will be there. The evidence will be there already. And so the investigation doesn't need to be so long or so intense. I also suspect that the third country, most likely China, will not cooperate in the investigation.
No, yeah.
So will rely on facts available. So specifically with SIFL, I suspect that things will be a little bit easier to get. I hope so, but I suspect so.
That's definitely what we are calling for.
Makes more sense when it comes to individual products and when it comes to forced labor, which is not state-based forced labor.
Private supply chain.
There does need to be an investigation process to make sure that things are plain. So this happens to be.
Yeah, no, that's definitely.
Make our point, because it's a nonsense to think that a factory using forced labor for shirts, but not for trousers and t-shirts and dresses and they also. We push for this.
No, I mean, you're not. I mean, you're preaching to already like someone who's convinced already on this. So that's not. And I'm saying like George and Maria Marnell that have been subjected to all these kind of arguments already in the past months. Smiling also. Definitely. I mean, that's also why we call for this lowering of the evidentiary standards, not only for state-imposed forced labor, but also for forced labor in private supply chains. But in state-imposed forced labor, that is even more important because there will be no cooperation from any country or any entity. And that's already planned in the Commission proposal. So we have the possibility already to, from the Commission proposal, to look at it from that perspective. However, what we miss from the Commission proposal is indeed like the kind of security that would be given by a decision made at the EU level rather than a decision made by a member state on its own, which would indeed expose that member state to potential retaliation. So that's where we were, that's in particular why we're asking also that there is, the Commission is taking a role as a competent authority and that there is a much more centralized approach to this kind of presumption of state-imposed forced labor. Maria Manuel, now is your turn. So Maria Manuel is the rapporteur of the IMCO committee for the European Parliament, and she's been one of the co-rapporteurs that have led all the negotiations. Thank you very much at the Parliament level, and just very recently came to a vote. Please.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I'll keep my remarks short by telling you about our work in the parliament, very difficult one, but I think we succeed for the moment, and in particular about the tools to fight state-imposed forced labor. As I'm sure you all know, we voted the parliament's position last week, Monday, with a large majority from EPP to left voting in favor, and no votes against. Most groups support a text that is, in my opinion, balanced and effective, building on the Commission proposal and adding to it some important provisions. Probably is not everything we want at the beginning, but also always in the parliament we need to negotiate and at the end to vote with a majority, and a large majority is very important in that moment, in this moment. It's good to remember that this proposal we have worked on is a product ban, and that means everything in it is focused on products. Every product can be investigated, and any product that contains a bit of forced labor in it will be banned, despite risk-based approach to set the priorities for investigation. However, we also need to ensure the ban on products has an effect on the rights of workers and in eradicating situations of forced labor worldwide, including state-imposed forced labor. In this particular aspect, there was a way to improve the Commission proposal, and we did so significantly, in my opinion, of course. Banning the products acts as an economic incentive to ban forced labor, and one much more powerful than having just good-willing companies demanding better practices from their suppliers. Of course, it's important too, but not enough. However, we had two powerful tools to change the situation on the ground, that is remediation and reversal of the burden of proof, and a tool to improve the enforcement of this regulation, empowering the Commission as competent authority. Let me explain it in a more detailed way. First of all, we have added remediation for the workers as a condition to withdraw a ban. This means that for a ban on a product to be lifted, companies need not only to demonstrate that they eradicated forced labor from the future products, from the same origin, of course, but also that they have compensated the victims of forced labor. It's a simple change in the text, but with potentially great impact in the workers' situation. It will also make it very difficult to revert any bans of products coming from regions with state-imposed forced labor, as remediation of those cases will be extremely hard to prove without systemic change, as you said before. Secondly, we have also to account for circumstances when forced labor is systemic, such in the case of state-imposed forced labor. With this audience, I don't need to explain how different state-imposed forced labor is from single uses of forced labor by one or more than one companies. The indicators used to capture it at different, and the scale makes it difficult to tackle it product by product. Launching separate investigations with the burden being placed constantly on authorities. That is why we reversed the burden of proof for products which have state-imposed forced labor in their supply chain. The identification of state-imposed forced labor will happen through the database included in the proposal. Experts will have to label specific sectors in specific geographic areas as having evidence of forced labor, and this labeling will guide the Commission in the adoption of delegated acts to reverse the burden of proof. Of course, it will still require a lot of resources and political backing to open investigations to these products and to conclude them with a ban. That's one of the reasons, not only one, but one of the reasons why we empower the Commission as the 28th competent authorities with the powers to investigate and ban products. We think that coordination among all competent authorities from the member states is of course very important, but not enough. So we need Commission as a competent authority similar to the other ones of the member states. With these three changes, we believe we give the Union the necessary tools in the fight against state-imposed forced labor. It's good to remember that this fight is a fight for human rights, but also a question of economic competitiveness. Companies operating in the EU and implementing high labor and social standards cannot be undercut and suffer unfair competition from companies using forced labor or operating in areas where state-imposed forced labor is a reality. And my last sentence goes to you all and the many people working for the workers' rights around the world, including situation of state-imposed forced labor. If this proposal exists, and we have so much material and evidence to use in our work, it's because you have been fighting against forced labor for a long time. Thank you for that effort, and please don't give up. Don't give up now to pressure the Council for even better solution than those the Parliament approved. I hope we can quickly approve this regulation so that slowly but steadily we can eradicate forced labor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to spend this time with us. We have a few drinks and biscuits to nibble on if you want to stay with us, and our colleagues from the Uyghur and the Turkmen region and the coalition are here also to respond to your question if you have any. Thank you.